The ink on the papers was still wet when Silas Thorne realized he'd just signed away the last piece of his father's ghost. The courthouse steps felt harder than they used to, or maybe Silas was just feeling every one of his 73 years settling into his bones like the Kansas dust that never quite washed out. He folded the deed transfer papers with hands that trembled, not from age, though that played its part, but from something deeper. Something that felt like cutting the last thread holding him to a life that had been bleeding out slowly for decades. The drive back to the farmhouse took him past Miller's grain elevator, its paint peeling like old skin, and the abandoned Sinclair station where Tommy Hendricks used to fix tractors until the bank took his tools. The whole county was dying the same slow death, had been since the 80s when the rains stopped coming regular and the government checks stopped coming at all. But Silas had held on longer than most, stubborn as the cockleburs that still grew wild along his fence line. The house sat like a tired old man at the end of the gravel drive, its white paint gone gray with neglect and its shutters hanging askew. 47 years he'd lived there alone, ever since Martha packed her Buick and drove toward Topeka without looking back. Said she couldn't watch him turn into his father, couldn't stand another summer of watching the sky for clouds that wouldn't come. He'd stood on that same porch then, too proud to call after her, too broken to follow. Now the moving truck would come Tuesday, and he'd drive his pickup toward town with nothing but a suitcase and whatever memories he could fit in the cab. The Hendersons had bought the land sight unseen, developers from Kansas City who saw strip malls where he saw the ghost of his father's wheat. They'd probably bulldoze the house first thing, scrape away a century of Thorne family history like it was nothing more than an inconvenience. Inside, the rooms echoed with emptiness. He'd already sold or donated most everything worth keeping, leaving only the heavy furniture too worn for anyone to want and too big for his new apartment above the pharmacy in town. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the coffee he'd made that morning, probably the last pot this old house would ever brew. The living room felt cavernous without Martha's quilts on the furniture, without the family photos she'd taken when she left, claiming they were hers by right of being the only one who'd ever dusted them. He moved through the house like a stranger, noting details he'd stopped seeing years ago. The water stain on the hall ceiling from when the roof leaked in '98. The scratch on the hardwood floor where he'd dragged Martha's Hope chest the day she moved it to the bedroom they'd never filled with children. The silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the house settling around him like it was finally giving up. That's when the wind started. October wind in Kansas doesn't ask permission. It arrives like judgment, cutting through the gaps in old windows and finding every loose board, every weak joint. This wind came from the northwest, carrying the smell of wheat stubble and something else, something that made the hair on his arms stand up despite the warmth of the afternoon. The house began to speak in groans and whispers, the language of old wood under pressure. Something shifted overhead. Not the usual settling sounds he knew by heart, but something different. Something that sounded almost deliberate, like footsteps in the attic he hadn't entered in 15 years. Silas stood at the bottom of the narrow stairs that led up to the storage space, his hand on the smooth-worn banister his grandfather had carved from oak. The sound came again, not footsteps, but something sliding, something being moved by forces he couldn't see. The rational part of his mind said it was just the wind, just the old house responding to pressure changes like it always had. But something deeper, something that had been sleeping in his chest for decades, told him to climb those stairs. The attic smelled like dust and disappointment, like all the things a family stores away when hope runs out. Boxes of Christmas decorations from happier years, Martha's wedding dress in a garment bag gone yellow with age, his father's army uniform in mothballs and regret. Light filtered through the single window, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories in the still air. That's when he saw it, a rusty cigar box that had fallen from behind one of the support beams, its contents scattered across the rough plank floor like secrets finally refusing to stay hidden. The handwriting on the first envelope was his father's, but the words inside belonged to a man Silas had never known. The paper was yellowed with age, soft as moth wings between his fingers, and the ink had faded to the color of old blood. The date in the corner read July 15, 1954. 2 years before Silas was born, 3 years deep into the worst drought Kansas had seen since the Dust Bowl. Dearest Margaret, the wheat is gone. All of it. Nothing but stubble and dust where there should be gold, and I can't look at Mary without seeing the fear in her eyes. She doesn't say it, but I know she blames me for staying when smarter men pulled up stakes and headed west. I blame myself too, if I'm honest, but a man can't just abandon his father's land, can he? Even when that land turns against him like a lover gone cold. I think about you every day. About what you said in the barn that morning before the rain stopped for good. About what we almost did, what we should have done. Mary's a good woman, but she's not you, Margaret. She never was you. Silas read the words twice before they penetrated the fog of disbelief. His father, stern, silent Thomas Thorne, who'd rarely spoken more than necessary and never about feelings, had written love letters to someone named Margaret. Someone who wasn't Silas's mother, Mary, who died when Silas was 12 and been buried in the family plot with the simple words, "Beloved wife and mother," carved into granite. He picked up another letter, this one dated 3 weeks later. Margaret, I drove past your place yesterday. Saw Jim loading the truck, saw you holding little Sarah while she cried. You're leaving, aren't you? Following the others west where the rain still falls and a man can make something of himself without fighting the sky every day. I don't blame you. God knows I don't blame you. But I can't come with you. Not with Mary carrying the baby and winter coming on hard. A man makes choices, and then he lives with them, even when they tear him apart inside. Even when he knows he's choosing duty over the only real happiness he's ever known. Take care of yourself, my darling. Take care of that little girl. And if you ever think of the stubborn fool who let you go, remember that some cages are made of honor, and some of us are too weak to break free. The baby. Silas sat heavily on an old trunk, the letters trembling in his hands. His mother had been pregnant with him when his father wrote these words, when Thomas Thorne had watched the woman he loved drive away into a future that didn't include him. The dates on the letters continued through that autumn and into the winter, each one more desperate than the last. The final letter was different. Shorter. Written in a hand that shook with more than just cold. Margaret, I heard you made it to California. Heard Jim found work in the orchards and you're expecting again. I'm glad. God knows one of us deserves to be happy. The baby came early. A boy. Mary wants to name him Silas, after her father. I didn't have the heart to tell her I was hoping for a name that didn't sound so much like a man tied to a place he can't leave. I won't write again. It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to Mary, and maybe it's not fair to this boy who'll grow up thinking his father chose this dead land over everything else. Maybe he'll be right. But Margaret, if you ever wonder why I couldn't follow you, if you ever think I didn't love you enough, know this, I loved you too much. Loved you so much I couldn't bear to watch you grow to hate me when the dust settled in your hair and the hope died in your eyes like it died in Mary's. Better to let you remember me as the man who almost ran away with you than to become the man who dragged you down into this endless Kansas grave. All my love, always, Thomas. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the window frame and sending something rolling across the roof. But Silas barely heard it. He was too busy understanding, for the first time in his life, why his father had been such a distant man. Why Thomas Thorne had worked from dawn to dusk without speaking. Why he'd stared out at the empty fields like he was looking for something that would never come back. His father hadn't chosen the land over love. He'd chosen duty over desire, responsibility over happiness. And in doing so, he'd created a son who would spend his entire life feeling like a consolation prize in a game he never knew was being played. The irony cut deep and true. Silas had blamed his father for being tied to the land, had sworn he'd never make the same mistake. But when Martha left, when she said she couldn't watch him turn into his father, he'd let her go without a fight. Had stood on that porch nursing his pride and his hurt, convincing himself it was noble to stay, to honor the family commitment to soil that grew nothing but heartache. He'd become his father after all, just in reverse. The letters lay spread across his lap like pieces of a puzzle he'd never known was broken. Outside, the October sun was setting, painting the empty fields the color of old copper, but Silas couldn't look away from his father's words. Each page was a window into a man he'd never understood, a man who'd carried a secret love like a stone in his chest for 47 years until he died. Silas remembered his father's funeral. How few people had come, how little had been said. The preacher had talked about Thomas being a good man, a hard worker, devoted to his land and family. But the words had felt hollow even then, like they were describing someone none of them had really known. Now Silas understood why. The real Thomas Thorne had died in 1954, the day he chose duty over love. Everything after that had been just going through the motions. He found himself looking around the attic with new eyes, wondering what other secrets might be hidden in the shadows. But this rusty cigar box seemed to be all his father had left of his true self, these letters and a few photographs Silas hadn't noticed before. Pictures of a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, holding a little girl who looked to be about 3 or 4. Margaret and Sarah, he supposed. The family his father had loved but couldn't have. In one photograph, the woman was laughing at something outside the frame, her head thrown back with pure joy. It was the kind of laughter Silas had never heard in his own house, where silence had been more common than conversation and happiness had always felt like something that happened to other people. He held the photograph up to the fading light, studying the woman's face, trying to see what his father had seen. She was pretty, certainly, but there was something else, a warmth, a lightness that seemed to radiate from the picture itself. She looked like someone who could make a person believe in better tomorrows, someone who could make even the Kansas dust seem romantic if she was standing beside you in it. Silas thought about Martha then, about the woman who'd agreed to marry him when they were both 22 and still believed the farm could support a family. She'd been pretty too, and kind, and patient with his silences. But she'd never looked at him the way Margaret looked at the camera in these pictures. And maybe, the thought came like a knife between his ribs, maybe he'd never looked at Martha that way either. Had he married Martha because he loved her, or because she was there and willing and it was what young men were supposed to do? Had he been settling for what was available instead of waiting for what might be extraordinary? The questions felt dangerous, like picking at a wound that had never properly healed. A sound from downstairs broke into his thoughts, the front door creaking open on hinges that needed oil. For a moment, panic fluttered in his chest. The house had been sold, but the closing wasn't until tomorrow. The Hendersons wouldn't have a key yet, and besides, they were city people who wouldn't drive out here in the evening. "Hello?" a voice called from the front hall. A woman's voice, unfamiliar but not unkind. "Mr. Thorne? I saw your truck outside. I hope you don't mind, but the door was unlocked." Silas gathered the letters quickly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't ready to explain these discoveries to anyone, wasn't ready to share his father's secrets with a stranger. The photographs he slipped into his shirt pocket, the letters back into the cigar box. The attic stairs creaked under his weight as he descended, the box tucked under his arm like contraband. In the front hall, a woman waited. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and clothes that suggested she was more comfortable in a garden than a parlor. She had kind eyes and work-worn hands, and something about her seemed familiar in a way that made his chest tight. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, and her voice carried just a trace of an accent he couldn't place. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. I live over in Council Grove now, but I grew up around here. I heard you were selling the place, and I wanted to ask." She paused, looking around the empty rooms. "I wanted to ask if you knew anything about a woman named Margaret who used to live in these parts. She would have left in the 50s, during the drought. She was my mother." The cigar box felt suddenly heavy in Silas's hands, like it contained more than just paper and memory. He looked at Sarah Mitchell, really looked at her, and saw it then. The dark hair was silver now, but the bone structure was the same. The kind eyes were identical. She was the little girl in the photographs, the child who'd cried when her family loaded up the truck and headed west. "I might know something about that," he said, his voice rough with dust and revelation. "Why don't you come in and sit down?" Sarah Mitchell sat at the old kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold while Silas told her about the letters. The cigar box lay open between them, its contents spread like the pieces of two broken lives finally coming together after 7 decades apart. "She never stopped loving him," Sarah said quietly, touching one of the photographs with gentle fingers. "Mama used to sit by her bedroom window in California, especially in the spring when the wind came from the east. She'd get this look on her face, like she was listening for something that never came. When I was older, I asked her about it. She said she was listening for Kansas, for the sound of wheat growing. But I think now she was listening for him." Silas poured himself another cup of coffee he didn't want, just to have something to do with his hands. "Your father, Jim, was he good to her?" "Good as a man could be when he knew he was second choice," Sarah said. "He never said it, but we all knew. Daddy loved Mama fierce, but she loved him gentle, if you know what I mean. Different kinds of love entirely." She picked up one of the later letters, scanning the familiar handwriting. "She kept these, you know." Mama had her own box of letters, hidden away in her closet. Every letter your father ever sent, plus ones she wrote back but never mailed. The kitchen felt suddenly too small, too full of ghosts and might-have-beens. Silas walked to the window, looking out at the fields that would soon be strip malls and parking lots. She wrote back. 47 years' worth. Letters about us kids, about California, about the garden she planted every spring. But mostly about missing Kansas. Missing him. Sarah joined him at the window, and for a moment they stood together in the gathering darkness. "She died 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and hard, like she didn't want to be a burden. In the end, she kept asking for Thomas. Not Daddy, he'd been gone 10 years by then, but Thomas. The nurses thought she was confused, but I knew better." Outside, the wind had calmed, leaving behind a stillness that felt expectant, like the land itself was holding its breath. Silas thought about his father, working these same fields day after day, never knowing that somewhere in California a woman was writing him letters she'd never send. "What happened to the letters she wrote?" he asked. Sarah smiled, and in that expression he saw her mother's joy from the photographs. "They're in my car. All of them. I've been carrying them around for 3 years, trying to work up the courage to come back here. When I heard the land was being sold, I knew it was now or never." She returned to the kitchen and came back with a shoebox, old and soft with handling. Inside were hundreds of envelopes, all addressed to Thomas Thorne in careful handwriting, all marked "Return to Sender" in different colored inks, as if Margaret had kept changing her mind right up until the moment she didn't send them. Silas opened one at random, dated 15 years after his father's last letter. "My dearest Thomas, Sarah graduated high school today. She's smart like you, stubborn like me, and beautiful like neither of us deserve. She wants to study agriculture at UC Davis. Says she wants to understand the land, to work with it instead of against it. I think about telling her about Kansas, about you, but what would I say? That her mother was a coward who ran away from the only man she ever truly loved? I wonder if you ever think about what might have been. If you had a family, if the farm prospered. I hope you found happiness, Thomas. I hope you found a love that stayed. Always yours, Margaret." "She never knew about me," Silas said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "Never knew he had a son." "She knew," Sarah said gently. "The later letters mention you. She heard things through the grapevine. You know how it is in small towns. People talk, News travels. She knew when your mother died, knew when you got married, knew when your wife left. She even knew about the drought years, how you almost lost the farm in the 80s. She pulled out another letter, this one more recent. Thomas, I heard Silas is struggling to keep the farm. I wish I could help somehow, wish there was a way to reach across all these years and miles. He's your son, but he's carrying our heartbreak too, isn't he? The weight of choices made by people he never knew he was connected to. If something happens to me, I want Sarah to find you, to find him. These letters shouldn't die with me. Maybe it's time for the truth to come home. With all my love, Margaret. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of decades and the echo of lives lived at cross purposes. Finally, Sarah spoke. She left instructions. In her will. Said if I ever found the courage, I should bring the letters back to Kansas, back to the farm. Said maybe it was time for the Thorne family to know they weren't alone in their grief. Silas felt something breaking open in his chest, some hard kernel of resentment and disappointment that he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. She wanted to come back? Every day of her life. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. But she was afraid. Afraid you'd hate her for taking your father's happiness. Afraid she'd disrupted your family enough just by existing. My father never stopped being sad, Silas said, the admission coming from somewhere deep and previously untouchable. I thought it was the land, the drought, the failure of everything he touched. I blamed him for giving up, for not fighting harder. But it wasn't the land that broke him. It was losing her. And you've been carrying that sadness too, haven't you? Sarah asked. Wondering why you could never make anyone happy, why every relationship felt like settling for less than what you really wanted. The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. Yes, he had been carrying it. His father's unfulfilled longing had been passed down like a genetic trait, coloring every choice, every relationship, every quiet evening spent staring out at empty fields and wondering why nothing ever felt quite right. The land is sold, he said eventually. I signed the papers this morning. This time tomorrow, it'll belong to developers who'll scrape away every trace of our family. Sarah nodded, understanding. Mama always said the land wasn't the important part. She said love doesn't live in dirt and wheat. It lives in memory and story and the courage to believe in second chances. She gestured toward the letters, toward the evidence of a love that had survived drought and distance and death itself. These letters, both sets, they're proof that some things endure even when everything else fails. Your father loved my mother for 47 years without hope of seeing her again. She loved him back just as long, across half a continent and through 2 other lives. That's not failure, Mr. Thorne. That's the most successful love story I've ever heard. As if summoned by her words, the wind began again, but gentler this time. It moved through the house like a presence, stirring the letters on the table, carrying the scent of autumn wheat and distant rain. Through the kitchen window, Silas could see the first stars appearing in the clear Kansas sky. There's something else, Sarah said, reaching into her purse. Mama left this for you, if I ever found you. She handed him a sealed envelope, heavy with the weight of final words. His name was written on the front in the same careful handwriting he'd been studying all evening. Inside, the letter was brief. Silas, by the time you read this, I'll be gone, and you'll know the truth about your father and me. I hope you can forgive an old woman's choices, and forgive your father for loving someone he couldn't have. Thomas was a good man caught in an impossible situation. He chose honor over happiness, duty over desire. He chose you and your mother over his own heart. That doesn't make him weak, it makes him the strongest man I ever knew. You are his son in all the ways that matter. You have his strength, his stubborn loyalty, his capacity for deep feeling. Don't let our old sorrows poison your remaining years. Don't let the fear of abandonment keep you from trying again. The farm may be gone, but the best of your father lives in you. Take that with you wherever you go. With love and hope for your future. Margaret. P.S. Sarah has something that belonged to your father. Something I kept all these years, hoping someday to return it. Sarah reached into the cigar box and withdrew something Silas hadn't noticed before, a small object wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a simple gold wedding band, worn smooth with age. He sent it to her in the last letter, Sarah explained. Said he couldn't wear it anymore, couldn't pretend his marriage was what it should have been. He asked her to keep it, to remember that somewhere in Kansas, someone had loved her completely. Silas took the ring, feeling its weight, feeling the decades of his father's longing made tangible. It was smaller than his own wedding band, the one he'd stopped wearing after Martha left, but somehow it felt heavier, more significant. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked. Silas looked around the kitchen one last time, memorizing details he'd see again only in dreams. The morning light switch by the door, marked with decades of fingerprints. The spot on the linoleum where his mother's chair used to sit. The window that had framed every sunrise and sunset of his adult life. "I don't know," he said honestly. "For the first time in my life, I really don't know. But maybe that's not such a bad thing." Sarah smiled, and again he saw her mother's joy shining through. Mama used to say that not knowing what comes next is just another word for possibility. They packed the letters together, both sets returning to their respective boxes. Sarah would take her mother's words back to California, but she left copies for Silas, photocopies made years ago in preparation for this moment. The original letters from his father, she insisted, belonged with the land where they were written. "Even if that land becomes a shopping center?" Silas asked. "Especially then," she said. "Love letters don't need fields to be real. They just need someone to remember that they were written." They stood on the front porch as Sarah's car pulled away, her taillights disappearing into the Kansas darkness. Above, the stars were bright and infinite, and the wind carried the promise of change. Not the harsh, destructive change that strips away everything familiar, but the gentle, persistent change that makes new growth possible. Silas went back inside and climbed the stairs to his old bedroom, the cigar box tucked under his arm like a treasure chest. He would sleep one more night in the house where he'd been born, surrounded by the ghosts of 3 generations of Thorns. Tomorrow he would drive to town, to his new apartment, to whatever came next. But tonight, for the first time in decades, he wouldn't fall asleep listening for the sound of someone leaving. Instead, he would listen to the wind, and to the whispered promise it carried, that some loves endure beyond reason, beyond hope, beyond the grave itself. The land was gone, the house would soon follow, but the drought inside his soul, that endless, devastating drought, had finally broken. In its place, something green and growing had taken root, the understanding that his father's love, however impossible, however tragic, had been real and deep and worthy of honor. And perhaps, if an old woman's ghost could find its way back to Kansas after 70 years, if 2 broken hearts could still beat in rhythm across the divide of death itself, then maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for Silas Thorne to believe in the possibility of his own second chance. Outside, the wind carried the scent of distant rain. If Silas Thorne's story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the strength found in understanding the past, or kindled hope in the midst of your own journey, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late for truth to come home. And of course, subscribe to our channel. Here we tell stories that heal, inspire, and prove that love endures, even in the most unlikely corners of memory. Until next time, never stop believing in the power of second chances.